I worked in the registrar's office, and pretty soon thereafter, a friend of mine, Gwendolyn Higginbotham, who was a friend of the family, she was the national finance chair of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. I didn't know a thing about the sorority. I mean, I had gone into Delta, but I didn't know anything about nationally. I went into the sorority when I was in college, of course, and Gwen was on the executive board and knew that they were interested in starting Delta headquarters. And so um, when they needed a staff person to kind of organize the materials, Gwen put my name in. And so Dorothy Height had been to speak in Bluefield because she was a friend of Gwen's. And I knew who these people were, but I had never really met them or, had any association with them. So the first thing they did was sent me out to Kansas City to live with B. Penman, who was the national treasurer at that time. B. Penman was our treasurer, and I lived with her for a month, and I got to know everything about the organization's funds and how they were received and how they were responded to and how they were banked and the whole layout that B. Penman and staff had created. But it was out of her home. And so I stayed there for a whole month just getting all the information I could get from her, because she was, had been at this job for a long time. B. Penman was treasurer for a long time. And I think they were really fortunate to have a person that conscientious and who gave up part of her basement to house the office of Delta Sigma Theta.
She kept everything for the whole organization?
But the organization was nowhere near the size it is today. It was a big organization, and it was a national organization, but it wasn't like it is today. And she banked there, and she received all the mail there, and it was just unbelievable. But we had grown so that it was obvious we needed a different set of plans, a new system for keeping the headquarters money, keeping Delta's funds. And so I stayed there for a whole month and learned as much as I could and helped to pack up, because we knew eventually we were going to be moving to D.C. We didn't know when or where, but we knew we would be. That was the plan that had been approved by the headquarters staff, by Delta's national staff. And so the next thing, the month of October, I spent in Cincinnati, Ohio, with Reba Can, who was the national secretary. So I had the experience of having started with the national treasurer for a month, and then I spent a whole month with the national secretary in Cincinnati. Lived in her home, Dr. and Mrs. What was his first name? Her name was Reba, and he was a physician and had a lovely home, several children, had a daughter almost my age who was then thinking about, what was she doing? I mean, she was younger than I because she was still in college. Anyway, I lived in their home. So Delta was very responsive at that time to think that they would open up their homes and let the strange young lady in. But I don't think if it hadn't been for that kind of, I think my dad would not have let me go. He was still, even though I was a graduate, parents had a lot to say about what you did and didn't do in those days. And Gwen Higginbotham, who was the finance chair, as I said earlier, was the person that kind of spearheaded this whole thing. And I lived with her for a month. The next month was planning for the American Council on Human Rights Convention, ACHR. Elmer Henderson was the director. And this woman, Patricia Roberts Harris, was working for the American Council on Human Rights. She was the executive director, along with Elmer Henderson, who was, I think, the president of the organization or something like that. I didn't know much about either one at the time, but I learned an awful lot in the process. So, I met Pat. I helped us plan the convention, ACHR, and all these sororities and fraternities came together. Can you believe that Deltas, AKAs, the Zetas, the Kappas, the Omegas, and the Alphas all came together and had a convention? And I'm thinking that convention was in D.C. I've forgotten where it was. I just remember that it was during the Christmas, right after the Christmas holidays, we had this ACHR convention. And there were people there from everywhere. Now, can you imagine? All these people came together, and it wasn't as large as Delta is today.
Wow.
But it was a wonderful experience. I remember it so clearly in my mind how we came together and met all people from all walks of life, everywhere. It was wonderful. And soon thereafter, in January, sometime in January, Dorothy Height was ready to move on making this thing happen. We had talked about it. It had been approved at the National Convention. We were ready to go. And I don't know where the minutes are or anything from that convention, but I know that it was approved. And in January, early January, Dorothy was in D.C. And so was I by then. That was where I was living, and so was Patricia. Patricia had been hired at ACHR. So in essence, Letitia Johnson was the first hired staff person for Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And I worked, as I said, in these two communities with the national secretary and the national treasurer. And then I went to D.C., and Patricia and I started looking around, trying to see what we could come up with in terms of a plan to move all this stuff into D.C. And we didn't have a headquarters building. So on a Sunday evening, Dorothy Height was at the Mayflower Hotel. She'd been there for some meeting that weekend with other Deltas, because Gwen was there, Gwen Higginbotham, and so was V. Penman, and I'm trying to think who else was there. Of course, Pat and I were there. And we were all in Dorothy's room at the Mayflower Hotel, where she had been working all day, ripping and running, and she was exhausted. So she said, well, come on up to my place, my suite. And we were looking through the Washington Post for some property. We just wanted to see what was available in D.C. at that time. And it turned out that we saw this building listed at 1814 M Street Northwest. Well, that wasn't too far from where we were in this hotel right then, at Mayflower Hotel. And it struck everybody that knew about it. You know, it seemed like a very exciting, interesting opportunity to go further. So Dorothy and Patricia knew this young real estate dealer named David Bird, who was practicing architecture, but he was also with Parks Real Estate Company. So they called him, and he came. We made an appointment to meet the next day and go see this building at 1814 M Street, which we did. And he was the host that took us around. He had this big Cadillac. So we were all hosted around D.C. in this big car. Oh, it was fun. It was wonderful. That's the first time I remember seeing David Bird.
Wow.
And we saw the building. And of course the wheels began to turn, and he began to take some action on whatever you do to affect real estate sales or deals or whatever. But there had never been a black organization in that part of D.C.